issue, which is part of the inaugural issue that we have published this successfully this year. That focuses on extremism, artificial intelligence, and national security. It brings together leading scholars over the course of this year to examine the intersection of terrorism, emerging technologies, and national security. Each session is built around research published in our inaugural issue of the Global Extremism papers. The journal that will be published, as I mentioned earlier, is part of the work the program on extremism has been doing to advance scholarly work on questions of extremism and terrorism. And today is the first of 9 sessions through November. So every month we will have a new session with a new author. And we are starting this one with one of the most operationally urgent papers of the in this issue. And this session today focused on the same title that is produced for the paper, Ghost Guns and the Real Violence. I think the author himself will be elaborating more, but it's focused on the strategic use of, I think, a very concerning trend, which is the 3D-printed firearms. Particularly, it chose this paper, and the author chose the how 3D-printed firearms function within the far-right terrorist exploits. Our speaker is Dr. Yannick Velou-Lepage. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada, and one of the foremost experts on extremist innovation and proliferation of 3D-printed arms. His paper draws on a newly compiled data set, as you will see, of over 50 right-wing extremist incidents across Western countries between 2017 and 2025. The most systematic analysis of this phenomena today. I was delighted to read and review this paper as well. Dr. Velou-Lepage, we are delighted to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. So essentially, this paper builds on work that I published a few years ago in 2024 when I completed the first kind of comprehensive survey of the acquisition of 3D-printed firearms by REMV actors. And this paper, which was called Printing Terror, was published in the CTC Sentinel, and it looked at 35 cases of various right-wing or REMV actors either attempting to acquire, acquiring, or manufacturing 3D-printed firearm, and it focused largely on the motivation. So why were these individuals choosing 3D-printed firearms as opposed to conventional firearms or other modalities for violence? Now, as I was compiling and producing this paper, I also started asking myself questions about not only the motivation, but rather the strategic use. We had cases in which actors were clearly planning on using these firearms to go and inflict acts of mass terrors. And I was interested in developing that argument further. But at the time, it was outside of the original scope of the Printing Terror article. So when there was the call for paper by Program on Extremism, I became very excited because I saw this as an opportunity to expand on my previous work and to continue work that I think is extremely policy relevant. So what I did is I went back to the data set. So in the original paper, Printing Terror, we had 35 cases. I've been expanding this data set since then. We're now at over 55 cases, but at the time of publishing the POE paper, we were at 52. So these are essentially 52 cases in which individuals were seeking to acquire or build 3D-printed firearms. And these are essentially compiled from court records, government law enforcement record, media coverages and primary sources. We also receive a considerable amount of information from law enforcement with whom I've had the chance to work and collaborate on this project. Now, that being said, any cases that are kind of anecdotal, unverified, or anonymous, or have kind of unclear ideology were excluded from this data set and brought into a secondary data set, which is outside the scope of this focus. But what's interesting is when you start looking at these cases, you start seeing that there's different motivation, but also different strategic vision behind the acquisition of these firearms. So a really good example is the case of Pascal Tribou, who was this avowed anti-Semite operating in Quebec near Montreal. He had converted his apartment into one of the kind of the largest 3D printed firearm factories that I'd seen in an ideological setting. But in all his communication, in his writing, and in the indictment, it's very clear that his motivation were kind of defensive, right? He was building these firearms in case, an overreaching tyrannical government came knocking. He was steeped in COVID or anti-COVID conspiracy theories, and essentially he saw these firearms as a way of defending himself from government overreach. But some of the cases were much more kind of offensive focused. And these were cases in which it appeared that the acquisition or production of the firearm was to accumulate in a violent act. So what I did is I introduced what I called a two threshold test to the 52 cases. I asked essentially, did the individual move beyond kind of like extremist rhetoric and start conceptualizing a violent plan? So could we see movement from ideation to mobilization, if you will, in the individual's action? The second threshold that was introduced is whether the individual was actively seeking to obtain kind of the material required for this plot or this plan to actually become materialized, right? So there's cases in which people are writing and are discussing absolutely grandiose plans, which have absolutely no bearing in reality, and these were excluded. So essentially, I limited this to case where there's clear operational intent. Somebody is clearly seeking to do something with these firearms, something offensive, and case in which there's at the very least an active effort to make this plan feasible. And that brought us down to 30 cases, the majority of them in the United Kingdom, some in the United States, in Germany, Australia, Italy, the Netherlands, Croatia, Finland, Iceland, Ireland, Portugal, and one in Singapore. And you can see the breakdown here. What's important here is that we can see this truly as a kind of global phenomenon as opposed to it being restricted to one particular geographical setting. So based on that, I essentially went back to the data set, and this is where I was particularly excited with this project, that it allowed me to introduce new variables to our coding system. And I started coding these cases based on 13 variables that are shared across three main clusters. So the first one being actor characteristics. So essentially, who's behind these plots? So the age, the gender, whether there's relational dynamics, the ideological orientation, the degree and the mode of coordination. Are they coordinating with other people and how so? The source of inspiration. As far as operational dynamic, the planning behavior, the type of targets, the role of these 3PF or 3D printed firearm in the plot. Are they supplementing existing arsenals, or are they the sole weapon that is being envisaged by the perpetrator? And also the presence of ID. And this is something I'm going to return to later on. But this is something that I noticed as a pattern when I was creating or writing the first paper, Printing for Terror, and I decided to pay particular attention to. And as you're going to see in the finding, I think this is a place where the results are quite shocking. And then lastly, I was interested in kind of like the technical infrastructure, right? So like, what type of 3D printed firearm are they envisaging? What were they building? How far along in the process were they when they were intercepted? Um, and essentially this kind of notion, because I think that's also kind of telling in assessing how important that particular or how developed this particular plot was. Now, a couple of caveats here, and I think these are fairly important, is that the numbers that I'm giving out, 52 in this case, and 52 cases of intent of acquisition or manufacturing of 3D printed firearms, or 30 plots, to me is vastly underreported. And there's a bunch of reasons why this underreporting takes place, but I do think it's important to kind of keep this in mind. We're a bit limited on time. I've written another paper in Cahiers Policier, which is a Dutch journal, where I really dive into this question of underreporting. But essentially, what we see here is like one of them is like this notion of dark crime, right? A lot of these cases will go unreported as the nature of a terrorist plot. This is something that's generally done under secrecy, so there's this underreporting element. Often the ideological elements can be hidden. And this is something that's extremely important for investigators. I'm going to get back to this in the concluding remark. But there's cases where what starts off as a manufacturing investigation, so a firearm trafficking or manufacturing investigation, later uncovers an ideological element, and that ideological element is not always clear, and sometimes investigators who are, firearm investigators as opposed to national security investigators will miss some of these ideological elements. Also, more and more we're seeing this nature of like composite ideologies or the so-called salad bar extremism, and this can often kind of muddle how we categorize these elements. We also have cases where whether the firearm is 3D printed is not apparent. This is particularly true in cases where the 3D printed aspect is not the firearm itself, but rather is a convergent device, something like an auto sear. This is a scaled up version, but a small device that allows somebody to take something like an AR platform and turn it from semi-automatic to fully automatic, or something like a Glock switch, which again will turn a Glock into a fully automatic firearm. Investigators can simply miss that device, or simply the presence of these devices can simply not be reported. Limited media reporting. One of the things that we're seeing often is cases or the 3D printed aspect of a terrorist plot only comes out much later in the reporting cycle. Sometimes once the case goes to trial, sometimes the reference is simply passing. There's a few cases where there was no media reporting of the 3D printed aspect of it, but rather it was uncovered by looking at the pictures are presented at the trial or in the evidence docket. And again, when these cases first emerge, they gain a lot of media attention. But I do think as they become more and more common, they become more routine, they're perhaps less interesting to report on. There's another aspect here which is also specific to the plot, is that there's a strategic reason why a plotter post arrest might diminish the nature of his activity, right? Essentially, I wasn't planning, I wasn't building this firearm for a plot. I was doing it because I'm interested in 3D printing, or I'm interested in firearms, essentially trying to get a conviction for the act of manufacturing as opposed to getting a terrorism related conviction. So all these things are important because it does explain it does nuance these numbers, and it kind of shows us that what I'm presenting in many ways can best be understood as the tip of a terrifying iceberg, if you will. So, as part of this work, the first question that I was kind of interested to hear is, who are these plotters? So across the 30 plots, we have 55 individuals. The distribution is essentially kind of what I would have expected. Large number between 18 and 34. That's where the majority of them are, but a couple of interesting kind of outliers. Youngest individuals being 16, two of them in Croatia. Oldest individual being 66. So interesting outliers, as I said. One of the things that I thought was interesting, particularly because I do a lot of work on gender and terrorism, was the gender of the perpetrators. 93% of them were male, so higher than I expected. The other thing that I thought was quite fascinating here is out of the three women plotters in this data set, at least two of them appeared to have had kind of like an intimate partner relationship with another plotter. And there's a lot of work that's been done on agency of women within REMV cycles. Um, Here, not to diminish their agency, I do think it is interesting that it appears, at least in part, that the pathways into these plots were through intimate partner relationships. So something I think to be theorized further, at least to be looked at more uh, in the future, but an observation I think is worth doing. All right, a couple of other aspects I thought was interesting. So as a whole, the ideological spectrum, the motivations are essentially kind of what you would expect from REMV plotters, kind of a mixture of neo-Nazi, accelerationists, white supremacists, racial separatists, current, some anti-government, sovereign, citizen, Reichsbürger type ideologies in there. Also, unsurprising, many references in the writings and the interactions of plotters referencing back kind of like the saints of the far right, Tarrant, Breivik, Dylan Roof, all having serving as inspiration. And this goes back to like the wonderful work that Graham Macklin did in his article about the long shadow of Breivik, essentially this notion that Breivik's attack continues to reign as kind of like the supreme source of inspiration. So that was kind of expected. One of the things that I was slightly less expected was the presence of Stéphane Billet as an inspiration. So for those who may not remember, Stéphane Billet is the perpetrator of the Hala shooting in 2019. He is essentially he's kind of the archetype for the use of privately manufactured firearm in a terrorist plot, or at least in a REMV terrorist plot. But what I think is interesting here is that if you actually kind of look at Billet compared to Tarrant and Breivik and Dylan Roof, Billet's attack is often kind of seen as having been unsuccessful, right? And even during his live stream, he expresses frustration at his attack, which accumulates in the death of two individuals. And when you compare that to like Breivik's 77, I think I'm not at least 70 plus fatality, Terrence 51, Dylan Roof's 9 fatality. Billet seems to be kind of like this minor figure. But at least within these REMV plotters, he's often seen as an inspiration, is often referred back to an inspiration. I think this is something that's interesting. I think it would be worth kind of doing a kind of broader comparison, looking at 3D printed REMV plots compared to non 3D printed REMV plots, and see if Billet's importance kind of falls down for the non 3D printed REMV plots. My intuition is yes, but it's not something that was within the scope of this particular paper, but still particularly noteworthy here. All right. So where were these plots? Essentially what we see here is quite like a healthy distribution, if you will, of plots being intercepted at various phases of planning. So about a quarter of these plots were at the preparatory stage. So essentially there's manual, schematic, or precursor materials are acquired, but there's no functioning firearms. Some of them are experimental. Here we have kind of prototyping, testing. Individuals have started building firearms, have started testing these firearms, and have started kind of narrowing down their targets, doing things like reconnaissance. In 11 of the plots, we see them as operational, right? They could have gone live at any point. The firearms were operational, and there's clear kind of target identification that has occurred. So essentially, in some ways, we could argue that the interception occurred just on time. And then we have two of the plots where they actually accumulate an actual violence, and I'm going to talk about these uh, in a bit of detail now. So the first one is the Hala shooting, which I mentioned. Stefan Billet tries to storm the synagogue on Yom Kippur. He's armed with several improvised firearms. Some of them are manufactured using some 3D printed components, but one thing that's important to note here is that he also used a lot of other manufacturing techniques, such as like folding metals to do so. He's unable to breach the door, so I think this speaks to the importance like hardening sites of worship, and goes and kills two bystanders nearby before being arrested. In Finland, we
Probably
have
just, probably
yeah.
just a curious question. When I read the creation 1 year ago, to which year?
Pardon?
That YouTube channel was created 1 year ago to which year? Are we talking about like 2018, 2019? It's like what year that? I assume that is a YouTube channel that shows the firearm.
Yeah, so the second ass the sorry, are you talking about the second case, the Finland case?
Yes.
Yeah, so the second case occurs in 2023, and this is a case in Finland. Um, we actually know of this attack because it's broadcasted on an Odyssey channel. Odyssey is a bit like YouTube.
Yes.
It still remains live today, which is extremely problematic. But this Finnish cell, um, has this Odyssey channel in which they show them testing firearms. They talk about various ways that they're going to use them, and they also engage in kind of a fairly low sophisticated act of violence in which they plant an IED in the mailbox of a black family in Leti, and then they return to that house, and then they fire upon that house using an FGC-9, which is a 3D printed firearm. And this is what you can see on that picture. And I talk about this case extensively in my Printing Terror article because there's a lot of symbolic meaning behind that Odyssey channel as well. But these are the two executed plots. Um, so it kind of gives you an idea. In one case, we've got one that is executed, leads to fatality. The second one leads to property damage, but still, I think quite a worrying trend that we can see here. So target profiles. Who are these plots targeting? Again, I think the distribution here is very similar to kind of what we would expect within kind of like the broader REMV ecosystem. So in some ways, I think the way you start thinking about 3D printed firearm plotters with REMV ideology is that while the modality of violence might be slightly different, the ideology and the ideological targets remain similar. So essentially, what we see here: racialized minorities, ethnic minorities being the primary target, followed quite neatly with religious site or communities, political institution, or figures. Some general civilian targeting, so kind of discussion about doing kind of mass indiscriminate acts of violence, infrastructure, public utilities. So again, with this maps onto the accelerationist ideology, law enforcement, military, LGBTQ plus individual space. Some discussions about targeting women, feminist targets, medical, healthcare. This kind of relates to COVID conspiracies, and then one of the fact place I found really interesting was a German group which was envisaging using 3D printed firearms in order to attack uh, uh, ideological rivals, but of this, sorry, to attack rivals of the similar ideology. So in order to engage in an attack against other REMV actors using these firearms. Um, One of the things that we can see here, because so we're seeing 65 targets with 30 plots. This kind of particularly reflects the fact that a lot of the plots hadn't kind of matured yet, and the actors were still in the process of defining what their ultimate target was going to be. Um, so how did the attack? How did the what's the role of these three printed firearms here? Well, it really depends. In nearly 40% of the case, it's the primary weapon system. And I think this is fairly important because it essentially shows from like a law enforcement perspective that like if you're able to interrupt the pathways for production, either regulated parts or imported parts or 3D printers or access to files, then the plot essentially kind of falls apart, or at the very least, there needs to be a substitution effect and the plot needs to be reframed with a new weapon. In 13% of the cases, these are individuals thinking about modifying conventional firearms using 3D printed parts. This is where we can talk about like auto sears and switches, ways to increase the lethal potential of a conventional firearms by using 3D printing. And then in about half the plots, what we start seeing is that the firearms are still in development or in experimentation, or they're planned as opposed to having been acquired. So to kind of illustrate this, right, how different actors can think about a 3D print firearm very differently in their reports. Matthew Conjogger, 17-year-old white nationalist, he's arrested while attempted to acquire a 3D printed firearm, and he's having discussions with an undercover agent. He's planning on engaging in he's planning on killing an acquaintance, a former friend of his, because his friend, who's a racialized individual, has bragged about having intercourse with a white woman, and he decides that that individual needs to be punished for that. And in his interaction with law enforcement, he essentially says that he would rather have a conventional firearm if the undercover agent is able to procure him one. But if he's not, then he's going to settle for something like an FGC 9 or a Cheetah 9 instead. So in his case, he would much rather have a conventional firearm, but there's a substitution effect that occurs, and operating in the UK, he's happy with a 3D printed firearm instead. Alternatively, kind of on the opposite or conversely, we've got the case of Noah Edwin Anthony, who's a soldier, is an intelligence analyst at Fort Bragg. He obviously doesn't have any prohibition to own firearm, and he is stopped during a random vehicle inspection while he's entering his workplace, and and officers find an unserialized handgun and Nazi insignia. They later search his residence, and then they find three printed firearms, including an FGC 9, firearm components, white supremacist material, but also a manifesto in which he details a plan to attack black and brown residents in various communities in North Carolina. So this is a case of an individual who, at the very least, could have obtain a conventional firearm by legal means, uh, but for other reason chose, largely for like ideological reason, chose to frame his plot or to conceptualize his plot around 3D printed firearms. So I think this is kind of an interesting. It shows how these plots and the role of these firearms can be very different based on the actors and the climate in which they're operating. It also kind of rebuts this notion of like the substitution effect as the absolute motivation for 3D printed firearm, right? Like there's often this belief that, oh well, REMV actors are going to use a conventional firearm and will only settle for a 3D printed firearm if they don't have access to a conventional one. Well, the empirics don't support that assumption. All right. One of the most kind of worrying aspect that I've seen is the convergence of 3D printed firearm and IEDs. So in 70% of the plots, uh, the plotters are also engaged, at least at some degree, with IEDs, improvised explosive device. Either they are arrested with manuals on how to create them. Sometimes they have precursor chemicals, and in at least 5 cases, there is a constructed device that is found um, during the search of their property. And this has extremely important implication for personal safety and officer protection when you start thinking if you're a police officer or an investigator and you have a case where you suspect there's a manufacturing of 3D printed firearm and there's an ideological angle. Well, you've got like a 50% chance, roughly, of encountering precursor um, a non-negligible chance of encountering a constructed IED. So that should inform how a raid and how a search is conducted from a force protection standpoint. So a couple of cases here. So we've got one, Ryan Scott Bradford. This is an interesting case for many reasons. So essentially, he's a convicted felon. So there's a prohibition from owning firearms, and therefore he's printing firearms from like an ideological perspective. As you might be able to see it, he's actually painted a swastika on the printing bed of his 3D printer. Anybody who knows anything about 3D printing knows that that's probably not going to lead to like optimal printing condition, but nonetheless, I think that's very interesting from like the ideological perspective, right? Like it was important for him to do so, and that also kind of speaks to motivation, but in this particular case, law enforcement found a functioning IED during a seizure in his house. We've got a case in the UK again. Um, when they're arrested, um, there's several 3D printed firearms that are uncovered, and they're arrested due to their activity on Telegram. But in addition to the 3D printed firearm, explosive device are found, and then the Hala case, right? Um, Again, you've got both the 3D printed firearm aspect, but the explosive aspect, and also the Finland case, so both plots that have actually come to fruition, you've got functioning explosive device in these plots. So again, I think this is an aspect that's worth recognizing. All right, so I'm kind of mindful of time here, and I do want to let time for conversation, and particularly since a lot of what I'm talking about is in the paper, and I do recommend that you not only read my paper, but you read the entire issue because there's a lot of fantastic work that's been done here by Program on Extremism. But there are some implications here that are quite important. So one of them, I think it's important that we no longer think of this solely as like marginal or experimental. Um, we can see that there's now kind of clear empirics to support the argument that 3D printed firearm have entered the tactical repertoire of REMV actors and are most likely there to remain. Um, I think here there's also a one about like risk indicators, right? Um, Often what we start having is that the presence of 3D printed firearm can actually indicate the presence of a wider arsenal and that of a broader plot. And this is kind of something that when I do training with law enforcement, so obviously this varies by jurisdiction, but in Canada we have something called a Schedule A. When law enforcement investigators are going to go into a residence or a property to do a search, they have to create what's called a Schedule A, which essentially says this is what we're looking for, right? And that essentially stops law enforcement from just kind of like coming across stuff that is incriminating. They need to clearly articulate what they are searching for. So one of the things that I do when I'm giving training with law enforcement, I'm saying like, look, if you've got a case where you suspect that there's a manufacturing of 3D printed firearm, make sure that your Schedule A also includes ideological material. Because one of the things that we've seen is many of these plots were actually uncovered by accident and were uncovered during routine kind of firearm investigation. And this is going to seem like a hyperbole, but it is not. We have literal cases where law enforcement are tipped off. For example, the importation of parts that are going to be used in the creation of a 3D printed firearm by Customs and Border forces. They enter the residence in order to do this firearm trafficking or manufacturing investigation. And then in the wall of one of the room, there's a swastika flag. And now it's no longer a firearm manufacturing investigation. It falls into a national security investigation. So this is based on a real case in Australia, but there's several more of these cases throughout. So I do think this is something that's kind of worth keeping in mind for firearm investigators. Particularly as, you know, firearm investigators are not necessarily national security investigators, and there's kind of siloing of expertise that could then lead to a plot essentially kind of not being uncovered. And there was in fact a case in Ireland where somebody is first arrested on what appears to be a firearm trafficking offense, and then later is rearrested on a national security offense because on at the first pass the kind of full extent of the plot wasn't apparent. Digital diffusion. So I've written extensively about this, and obviously this changes audience and audience. In the United States, some jurisdictions have started cracking down on the distribution of files, but I think that remains to be tested to some extent, as it might come to bear that there's some objection from like the First and the Second Amendment. So the United States is kind of like its own ecosystem that has its own particularities in legislation and constitutional protection. But outside the United States, I think efforts to kind of counter this issue can really start at the file level. And I wrote a piece for GNet about a year ago called "Blocking the Blueprints," where I essentially talked about like technical solutions that could be implemented in order to try to block the fabrication at the blueprint level. It's also one of the reasons why the UK is disproportionately represented in this data set, is because a lot of uh, their counterterrorism legislation allows law enforcement to kind of make that leap and say that the possession of 3D printed firearm in conjunction with ideological material makes a 3D printed firearm files kind of material support for terrorism. And then lastly, as I said, kind of force protection aspect, right? And this is, I think, is particularly clear on the IED side. This is something that we saw really being pushed on investigators and law enforcement in the aftermath of 9/11, saying like, there's cases where the FBI enters a domicile thinking that it's a meth lab or a drug production factory, and then it turns out it's an IED factory, right? So essentially allowing individuals, giving the training required to frontline law enforcement to recognize these type of activities being particularly important, but also just kind of briefing law enforcement and showing that like the empirics bear that the 3D printed firearm is often associated with arguably the more dangerous IED threat. So this kind of gives you a broad overview of the paper. Obviously, this is one part of a much broader research agenda, so I welcome questions on this or on this broader phenomenon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Yannick. That was a rich and genuinely unsettling to be honest, set of facts and findings. I think what struck me the most is the 70% IED convergence figure. I think that is something that's going to stay with the audience, but with me as well. I think now let me go through some questions. I do have multiple questions, but two relevant questions from the audience. One will take us back to the stages, which I also really want to understand more about. That these stages of holding the plots. The question from a person known as John B is asking, in which section would you put the manufacturing of your homemade ammunition? Because that's also the question of the firearm itself, the ammunition it needs.
Yeah, so it depends on where in the process of manufacturing the ammunition takes place. But this is something that, like, for many years, particularly in Europe, was kind of seen as a protective factor, right? Well, extremists can build a 3D printed firearm, but if they don't have access to ammunition, then we're okay. And essentially what we kind of see is that the 3D printed firearm community has really tried to respond to that bottleneck. And they've done this in several ways. One, there's a bunch of experimental projects that are looking at using gunpowder. So there's a designer who I won't name, but his kind of shtick, if you will, is creating a pump action 50 cal shotgun, which is electrically ignited and uses gunpowder as opposed to conventional propellants. Gunpowder has a much kind of lower defragmentation force and therefore is able to be used um, uh, with plastic bearing parts or with load bearing parts that are made in plastic. The other thing that we've seen kind of being made out of this is that there's a manual that's out there which essentially explains how you could use a construction tool, essentially a ramsot, which is used to drive nails into concrete. And these are commonly available in kind of builder stores in the UK and in Europe. And how these and what they are essentially is that they use a 22 LR caliber in order to kind of push the nail into concrete. And what this manual kind of explains is how you can use these and create sleeves around the 22 LR in order to make it into a 9 millimeter ammunition. But this is also something that, like, the entire community is spending a lot of time thinking about. Now,
Yeah.
it's worth kind of mentioning that the 3D printed firearm community is not necessarily an extremist community. It really is ideologically a kind of broad tent. There's people with REMV ideology. There's a fairly substantial trans right activist element within the 3D printed fire gun community. There's people that are essentially ideologically agnostic and that are just interested in this technology. Um, but this community is kind of pushing the design challenges further and further and further. And what we're seeing is that extremist actors are clearly paying attention to these developments. So whereas several years ago the kind of like the ammunition bottleneck might have been a protective factor, it no longer is.
I think this question is relevant to what you were talking about, Yani. It is from Joel McCroy asking, beyond replicating or honoring previous notable attacks, what are the ideological drivers behind using the 3D printed firearms? I think you go extensively in your paper, but if you would like to respond to that question as well now.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge question, right? And really the paper that tackles this is my Printing Terror article. But essentially there's kind of like four main motivations. One of them is ideological. For some people, building the firearm itself, whether it's for offensive use later on or kind of like just defensive or just building it and then not necessarily plotting to use it. The fact of being able to build a firearm outside of the confine of state control can be seen as like an act of activism and can be ideologically fulfilling. We also know that, like, for extremist groups, right, the ability to create their own firearm can also kind of project a certain amount of capability. I remember after October 7th, there's this video that came out that purported showing Hamas creating 50 caliber sniper rifles, and there's analysis that was done of this video that essentially shows that, like, they might be creating their own privately manufactured firearm, but the video doesn't actually demonstrate this. And there's reasons for this. Like for example, like they're milling a barrel at high speed, and you've got like sparks and smoke coming out. And obviously, if you are doing precision, like a precision part like a rifle, you're not doing that at high speed. But nonetheless, it was important for Hamas post October 7 to kind of project this particular capability. Another aspect that 3D printed firearms have, like on the symbolic element, is the fact that they can be customizable. We've seen many, many cases of 3D printed firearms that have in the receiver a swastika or an ideological message. So therefore, like the firearm itself is no longer just a tool for violence, but is also a communicative tool. A bit like, Terrence and others have started scribing firearms by writing on them and making extremist references on them. We can think of 3D printing as like increasing that capability from the symbolic perspective. Another aspect is this kind of complementary, right? So essentially taking existing stock of conventional firearm and increasing their lethality with the use of auto sears and so on. A third kind of motivation that we see is the substitution, right? Somebody doesn't have access to a conventional firearm, and therefore a 3D printed firearm ends up being seen as the best tool that is available for them. We have cases of that. And then the fourth aspect, which I talk about in printing terror, is the financial element. Um, there is very little illicit activity that I can think of right now that has a higher return on investment than the manufacturing of 3D printed firearms. So something like an auto sear, uh, it's like maybe $2 a filament. It takes 8 minutes to print with a cheap 3D printers. You can sell these easily for $20. You can also put them on a conventional firearm and sell them for a lot more. Just to kind of give you metrics, in Europe, we've seen that the production in FGC9 can be about 300 euros, and they can sell for upwards of 3,000 euros on the black market to criminal elements. So we've seen several cases in which Renvi actors are essentially trying to support their activities by going to criminality, and instead of going to drugs or prostitution or other means of kind of financial support of terrorism, they've turned to 3D printed firearms. So those are kind of like the four large motivations, but I really encourage you to read the Printing Terror article where I really dive into that question.
Thank you again, Yannick. Very elaborate. I think I'm, I'm I'm pretty much interested in how you're going to answer this question, because I believe this question is going to explain how the operationality of the and the necessity of these firearms in the place when they are available, when they are needed, when there is also there are alternatives. So the question comes from Christy Thomas, and it says, is it mostly REMV actors using 3D printed guns? Question one. The question continues. I am thinking of the assassination of Shinzo Abe, where the gunman basically made his own firearm. In Japan, it is terribly difficult to get a gun, but they have very advanced tech versus many of these cases are in the US or the UK, where real guns do
Yeah.
exist. And access to real guns is sometimes much easier, oftentimes even cheaper than the 3D printed. So this, I think this is a very important question that will really help us understand more what is the ideology behind the 3D printed arms.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, and one that we could literally spend an entire hour on. In fact,
Yes.
often when I do this briefing, or 3D printed firearm briefing, I'll talk about the REMV aspect, which are really probably the most important end users, at least in the Western world, but they're by no means the only end users. So other ones that are worth kind of thinking about, so the Violent Dissident Republican group, ONH, at least on 5 occasions, we have seen them showcase 3D printed firearms in their propaganda. Now, and we know that they're viable because in one of the videos, they're actually shooting a kind of tribute volley to a deceased IRA member. Now, what's interesting with ONH is that, to my knowledge, they have never used those 3D printed firearm in any violent action. So essentially, they are there largely as symbolic. They're being showcased largely to kind of show capability. We've seen jihadi plots involving 3D printed firearms, albeit much less. But one of the part that I do think is quite interesting and worth noticing is that there's nonetheless kind of like an appetite amongst what we could call like unaffiliated sympathizers of group like Al Qaeda or the Islamic State. In fact, about a year ago, a semi-official Islamic State media outlet called Al Halan published an infogram, and the infogram itself was made in the same style as the Just Terror infograms that were in Rumia that would kind of explain how to do a vehicle ramming attack or a stabbing attack. So this infogram was published in the same style of this, and it essentially said like, "Hey, this is the FGC-9. This is what it is. It's a 9 millimeter carbine. It can be created entirely with unregulated part. You can find designs on various web forum, and then it even had this note, which to me it was extremely fascinating. It said like, hey, if you're having issues building the FGC-9, or if the FGC-9 is not the 3D printed firearm that you need for your operation, there's all these 3D printed firearm communities which are not extremists but will be really happy to help you and guide you in the manufacturing process as long as you don't tell them what you're trying to do, as long as you don't tell them, your end goal. So there's an appetite there. There's also one when we're talking about like the jihadi Salafist angle of like tech convergence. There's a case in the UK of a PhD student that was building a kamikaze drone using 3D printed. So not 3D printing firearms, but nonetheless using adhesive manufacturing in the commission of a plot. Other users, obviously there's a bunch of like criminal users that are outside the scope but are worth having a conversation about, and so on. Now, the other thing that's worth mentioning on your question is you mentioned Shinto Abe, the killing of Shinto Abe. One of the things that's really interesting is that the killing of Shinto Abe is not a 3D printed firearm. It falls under what's called a privately manufactured firearm, of which 3D printing is simply one of many ways to create a privately manufactured firearm. But in many ways, it's probably the mechanism that requires that has the lowest barrier for entry, right? So like buying a mill or a folding machine or a CNC machine is much more expensive than buying a $200 Ender 3 printer. So yeah, there's a whole other spectrum. We can also think about like it's a hard one to conceptualize. I'm not sure if it's far left, far right, where he falls on the ideological spectrum, but the killing of Brian Thompson, allegedly by Luigi Mangione, is also one to kind of keep note here. This was done using what's called a part kit completion. So essentially, the receiver of the firearm was 3D printed. All the parts were commercial parts, and the silencer was 3D printed as well. So essentially what we're seeing is various different actors are seizing upon this technology and using it for political reason. But at the end of the day, perhaps for ideological reason, perhaps because of the modality of violence that is preferred, REMV actors seem to be the most important end user so far.
Yeah, thank you. Because we have only 6 minutes left, I think there is a very important question also, which is related to one of the questions that I have had in mind, is about policy, about impacting policy to make the change that matters when it comes to limiting the misuse of 3D printing, whether it's for firearms or misuse of 3D printing in general in the other fields. But the question is from Natalie Brender, goes as how would you advise Public Safety Canada to take account of your findings in their upcoming review of Canada's firearms classification regime?
All right, so a great question, and Natalie, I really encourage you to also kind of reach out to me by email, and we can continue this conversation because it's a huge topic, right? Look, there's various approach. We're working on a typology of various ways to do this. Various countries are trying to achieve this in different ways. So one of them is essentially the notion that, there's already existing regulation about privately manufacturing firearms, as a whole, and therefore that's sufficient. There's the Canadian approach, what has just been done recently, where the legislation has been modified and explicitly mentions 3D printing. So I think that is helpful in kind of clarifying the activity. I also quite like how in Canada there's the intent aspect, right? So it's not just files. Having files themselves is not necessarily a criminal offense. Having files plus intent becomes is criminalized. Now, what intent is, I think, really needs to remain tested in court, right? Like, is intent somebody has taken the file and has put it into a slicer and has converted the STL into a G code? Is that sufficient for intent, or is intent starting to print parts, or is intent ordering ordering parts or that are necessary for the fabrication? I'm not clear. I think that's something that's going to need to be tested over the next couple of years. And then there's what other countries have done, like Australia, or various states in Australia, where they've created additional legislation that explicitly mentions 3D printed firearm. So that's one of the approaches to do. There's a lot that can be done both upstream and downstream. So when you start thinking about the files, there's stuff you can do about the printers themselves, but it's a huge ecosystem to be looked at. And I think just focusing on the end product, the firearm itself, still leaves a lot of vulnerability out there. But I'm really happy to have this conversation as a sidebar. Not something we can answer in 2, 3 minutes, and also something that's very jurisdiction specific. As I mentioned, in the United States, there's First and Second Amendment issues that need to be considered here.
Thank you again, Yannick. I think I got a question from Robert Campbell, and then I go to my final question, which is also on jurisdictions. The question says, will you put the slides somewhere? Would you make them available on the event website of the event? Yeah.
Robert, send me an email. I'm happy to share the slides that way. The email address is on the slide that's currently there.
Perfect. We have only 2 minutes, Yannick. I wish we can have more, but it's just the question. I mean, you highlighted in your paper very clearly that this is not just a matter of regulating the hardware itself. It is also the digital ecosystem, which reminds us also of the regulations related to the extreme contents online. There are mixed results. I mean, what are the jurisdictions? Are there jurisdictions that you think are getting this 3D printing right? Is there enough understanding that this is not just kind of hardware? This is not just carrying or printing a gun. It's much more beyond that.
Yeah, I think this is one of the part where kind of like the scientific literature is lacking, right? There's a lot of amazing work that is being done looking at the forensic and the technical side of 3D printed firearm. In Canada, there's Université de Trois-Rivières, which is doing absolutely stunning work on that, but also a lot of police agencies in-house are doing great work on the forensic side. I think what's really lacking is understanding the kind of broader digital ecosystem. And to my knowledge, there's 3 academic researchers working on this. There's me, there's Rajan Bashra, and there's Ruben Das. Look, we don't approach things like drug trafficking solely by having chemists to look at it. We also think about broader societal aspect, and I think this is what's required here.
Thank you, Yannick. Thank you for a genuinely important piece of research. As I mentioned, enjoyed reading your paper. And thank you also for presenting it with such clarity today. The policy implications here are immediate, and the data set you have built is a real contribution to the field. With that in mind, we look forward to seeing this work cited and engage with widely researched topic. Our next session is in this series is May 14th with Bennett Clifford, who will present his paper on violent extremism, extremist offensive cyber capabilities in the same field. Details are available on the program on extremism at the George Washington University. You can also see the future sessions that will be coming, because as I mentioned, we will be running a session every month. And you are always welcome to send us your ideas on papers you have in mind, research you want to write. We always welcome bright and new and innovative research. Thank you again, and thank you, Yannick. See you next month.